At the time of Christ, Greek civilization, in one form or another, had already been in existence for over 3,000 years. We don't immediately think of Greece in the context of the Bible. But of course, it was in existence all the time, and there are many connections, especially with the New Testament. It's these we're going to explore in these programs. Welcome to Ancient Bible Destinations. I'm David Suchet. I've been fortunate enough to visit and travel extensively around Greece. Yet even if you lived here, there still wouldn't be enough time to journey through the full length of its remarkably long history. So I'm going to look at what Greece was like at the time the first apostles of Christianity were setting out to tell their amazing story to the world. Of course, I'm going to encounter some ancient history along the way, and a lot of modern Greece too, as it's one of the world's leading tourist destinations. Oh, did I mention the food? The culture? The sunshine? Or the beaches? Like so many of the 21 million tourists who flock here each year, I'm going to start in the Greek capital, Athens, probably one of the most recognizable cities on the planet, and a place where history is deeply embedded in every square meter. Then we're going to head north to the region of Macedonia, which is where St. Paul first set foot on European soil. Our next stop is the area southwest of Athens called the Peloponnese, which is perhaps most famous for somewhere called Olympia. But I'm particularly interested in the equally ancient city of Corinth. And then finally, you can't come to Greece and not visit some of its famous islands. So we're heading for a group called the Dodecanese, which includes Patmos. Patmos has all the vital ingredients of a Greek island: blue sky, blue ocean, whitewashed buildings, beaches, historical ruins, and an old port. But it was here that while in exile, St. John glimpsed into the far future and wrote the powerfully apocalyptic last book of the Bible called Revelation. So, Patmos is probably also the perfect place to end our journey through the ancient Bible destinations of Greece. But right now, let's get started in Athens. Even if you've never been here before, there are probably more famous ancient sites than you'll recognize immediately. And of course, they were all here when St. Paul arrived in the city in AD 50, on his own and very much a man on a mission. Joining us is Dr. Michael Scott, Associate Professor in Classics and Ancient History at the University of Warwick.
I've been studying and teaching about the ancient Greeks for years, and they really are an extraordinary force in world history. The creators of the first Olympic Games, the creators of democracy, philosophy, drama. Our world would simply not be the same without the ancient Greeks. And they knew it. And so did many of the cultures who came after them in the Mediterranean world, even the Romans, who really thought they knew a thing or two. They knew when they were beat as well. One of the great Roman poets, Horace, said this: "Captured Greece, captured her uncouth conqueror." The Greeks, and especially the Athenians, knew that they were important people, and so they were a tough audience.
And the message that Paul wanted to give them went against pretty much everything they had held dear for centuries. When you start to appreciate what he was up against in Athens, essentially an unknown loner challenging millennia of cultural practice and ideas, you begin to get an idea of just how deep was Paul's conviction about the story he had to tell, and just how much courage was needed to actually do the telling. As we visit Athens' many historic sites, we'll encounter St. Paul more than a few times. But first, let's have a look at what life is like here today. Modern Athens is home to around 3.8 million people, But many more millions of tourists visit the city every year. So it's hard not to bump into a few of them along the way. Like here on Lykovitos Hill, which provides panoramic views across Athens to the Aegean Sea. In Greek mythology, the rocky hill was created by the goddess Athena, and at one time it was topped by a temple dedicated to Zeus. It's hard to believe now, but at the time of liberation from the Ottomans, Lykovitos was completely bare. Reforestation commenced in 1880 and was completed in 1915. Winding your way back down to the centre of Athens, you'll come to Syntagma Square, the home of Greece's parliament, and really the birthplace of modern Greece. An impressive marble war memorial was built in front of the parliament to commemorate the greatest battles of the modern Greek army since independence. In its centre is depicted a slain soldier, and the monument is guarded day and night by a select troop of young soldiers known as Evzones. Here they are in their distinctive uniforms, performing the hourly changing of the guard with such discipline and precision. These uniforms also have historical significance, as they're based on the ones worn by the Kleftes, who were mountain-based freedom fighters. So this square is not just geographically at the heart of Athens, but it's historically at the heart of modern Greece. And if you want to enjoy it in style, you can stay right here in the rather grand Hotel Grande Bretagne. It became so popular with visiting celebrities, politicians, and even royalty, it became known as the Greek state's official guest house. There are just so many levels of history in Athens. You're never very far away from some aspect of it. So here, in the Monasteraki district, the narrow streets and neoclassical-style small buildings are characteristic of the Ottoman times. And in the Monasteraki Square is the 10th century Byzantine Padanasa church, which once belonged to the monastery that gives this district its name. Another era in history is represented by the 18th century mosque that also stands on this square. But in addition to plenty of history, Monasteraki is also known for the sheer variety of its little shops, and perhaps more importantly for tourists, its food stalls and restaurants. There can't be a more evocative place to sample gyros, which is one of Greece's more popular takeaway food, served with chips. In Greece, gyros essentially means turn, as the meat in this traditional snack is cooked on a vertical spit. If you're ready for a more substantial meal, it's only a short walk to the Plaka district, the oldest neighborhood in Athens and particularly known for its more traditional tavernas. When St. Paul came to Athens in the summer of AD 50, the city was of course even smaller, but for him, travel certainly wasn't a luxury. Often it was a necessity. On quite a number of occasions he had to flee to avoid imprisonment or something worse, and he traveled to Athens on just such one of these occasions. He arrived by sea, the boat anchoring in Phalliro, then the main port for Athens. Today, if you arrive in Athens by ship, you'll dock here in Piraeus, which is right next door to Phalliro. Paul sailed to Athens from northern Greece after fleeing from Thessaloniki. He was escorted by unknown men, most likely sympathizers, who simply dropped him off and then returned north. What we do know is that now he was entirely on his own. Paul, being Paul, decided to make the most of the wait. The book of Acts in the New Testament tells us that Paul wasted no time before he was making his presence known in the city. He had noted immediately the number of idols that were being worshipped and was stunned to see one altar that was dedicated to an unknown god. The Athenians were hedging their bets just in case they'd overlooked the really important god. Paul's message was about the one and only God, so he could be forgiven for possibly expecting a receptive audience. That the Athenians were clearly open to new ideas might have also encouraged him, and initially at least, he was indeed given a hearing. We're also told in Acts that Paul was preaching, and I quote, "in the marketplace day by day." That marketplace would almost certainly have been here at the ancient Agora, although it wouldn't have been called ancient in those days.
The basic translation of agora is marketplace. And of course it was that. People came from all over Athens to gather their goods, buy whatever it is they wanted, and get their water from the public fountain. But it was also so much more than that. This was where the democratic institutions of Athens were. This is where the business took place. It was also a religious space. The Athenians had their altar of the 12 gods in the agora. And it was also a legal space. This is where the law courts were, dispensing justice over 250 days a year. And when the era of the classical world had ended and the Hellenistic world began, the monarchs of the wider Mediterranean world wanted their place in this crucial space. They built beautiful buildings, stoas, places in which people could walk, discuss, debate, think. And when the Roman emperors came to power, they too wanted to build in the agora. Augustus set up an odeon, a place to speak and to be heard. So when Paul came to Athens, the agora was the obvious place to go.
It was a place of the people, the equivalent of the Roman Forum. And from the word agora, we get agoraphobia, meaning a fear of going into places where there are lots of people. When Paul was here, the agora's large square would have been surrounded by many government buildings, and everywhere he looked were the temples and altars to the myriad of pagan gods worshipped by the Athenians. And here's one of them, the beautifully preserved temple of Hephaestus, also called the Thesion. Inside it housed statues to both Hephaestus and Athena. It dates back to the middle of the 5th century BC and has survived largely as it was originally built over 2,500 years ago. It would have been surrounded by the small, busy workshops of potters, metalworkers, and sculptors. While it was built as a pagan temple, from the Middle Ages onward, it was a Christian church. The other impressive building on this site is the Stoa of Attalus. But this isn't the original because it was destroyed in the year 267. It was reconstructed in the early 1950s and today houses the Museum of the Ancient Agora. Because it's an absolutely faithful reproduction down to the very last detail, it's also often used in the study of ancient monuments. Completed in 159 BC and subsequently donated to the city by King Attalus II, the original was the world's first shopping mall and housed 21 shops on each of its 2 floors. Looking down across the ancient agora from the Acropolis, the sheer size of the Stoa is particularly apparent. The Temple of Hephaestus can be seen on the left, and the most prominent ruins in the center of this view are of the Odeon of Agrippa, which was built in 15 BC. Over the centuries, the agora was gradually abandoned and eventually built over, becoming a residential area. When excavations for the Athens to Piraeus rail line started in 1890, some of the first ruins were uncovered. Athletic competitions are one of the many concepts ancient Greece has given the modern world, including the Olympic Games, which have their origins in the ancient Panathenaic Games, dating back to 566 BC. And this is arguably the spiritual home of all athletics. The stadium looks exactly the way it would have looked back in 140 AD, although it was skillfully reconstructed from the ruins of the original. Perhaps not all that surprisingly, it's the only all-marble sports stadium in the world, and it's here that the first modern-era Olympics were held in 1896. Another ancient venue, still being used today, is this remarkable arena in the shadow of the Acropolis, called the Odeon of Herodes Atticus. It was built in 161 AD, seats 5,000 people, and today is the main venue for the annual Athens festival. Next door is an even bigger venue, the ancient theatre of Dionysus. And it was here that the innovative plays of the great Greek poets Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, and Aristophanes had their premieres. At the time of Paul, Greece was actually under Roman rule and had been for 200 years. But Athens remained a free city because the Romans were so impressed with its schools. Hadrian, in particular, went on a building spree in the middle of the 2nd century AD. He paid for the completion of the temple of Olympian Zeus, which had remained unfinished for over 630 years. The remaining ruins are very impressive in themselves and give some idea of the colossal scale of the completed temple. Only 15 of the 104 columns remain standing, while there's a 16th on the ground. It fell down during a huge storm in 1852. Close by is Hadrian's Arch, which actually wasn't built by the emperor, but was named after him to acknowledge his contribution to the city, particularly the completion of Zeus's temple. On one side, an inscription credits Hadrian as the founder of the new Athens. On the other, facing the Acropolis, Theseus is acknowledged as the founder of the old city. Another Roman emperor, Vespasianus, wasn't quite so fortunate when it came to having things named after him. These are the ruins of the public lavatories in the Roman Agora, and they're called the Vespasianes. The Parthenon was a temple dedicated to the goddess Athena, which must have made Paul shudder every time he saw it, although in practical terms it was mostly used as a treasury building. At the end of the 6th century AD, it became a Christian church, and then after the Ottoman invasion in 1456, it was occasionally used as a mosque. It wasn't until after Greek independence that the Parthenon became a protected monument, and serious attempts at restoration only commenced in 1975. It's still ongoing, as the constant presence of scaffolding and cranes attest. And among the many conservation issues is managing the hundreds of thousands of tourists who crawl over it every year. The sculptures considered most important or most at risk of damage, now mostly from atmospheric pollution, have been removed and are now on display in the new Acropolis Museum. These include some of the metopes, the frieze blocks above the architraves, which have been replaced with copies made of artificial stone. The friezes, carved in high relief, depict various mythical battles. The new Acropolis Museum is arguably one of the most remarkable museums in the world. The contrast of the modern and the ancient really is breathtaking, and it's built to the scale of the original. It doesn't disappoint on the inside either. There's over 4,000 square meters of ancient ruins in here. The main building is deliberately orientated to provide absolutely stunning views of the Parthenon. So it's sort of a museum within a museum. The restoration work performed here is painstaking and, not surprisingly, never-ending. Here, the caryatides are being cleaned using lasers so as to avoid any damage. These particular 5 statues served as columns on the smaller Erechtheian temple up on the Acropolis. Named after the sun god, Erechtheus, and completed in 420 BC, the Erechtheion stands on the exact spot where Athena was said to have planted her olive tree. Visiting the Acropolis is a memorable experience. The history is fascinating, and the views across Athens are stunning. If you can stay until sunset, you'll be treated with a magical sight as the monuments are rendered as silhouettes, and you really could be back in ancient times. Even if you're only in Athens for a short time, a tour of the Acropolis has to be a priority. Although, as you look out across everything else that the city has to offer, you'll want to stay longer. It's easy to see why Athens is one of the most popular tourist destinations on the planet. Paul's daily visits to the marketplace at the ancient agora soon attracted the attention of higher authorities. He was soon summoned to a meeting of the Areopagus Council. That meeting took place on Mars Hill, next to the Acropolis, with all its grand symbols of Greek civilization as the backdrop. The Areopagus was a council of aristocratic elders who were responsible for determining many administrative, religious, and educational matters. These were important people. And Mars Hill was a very significant site too, because it was here that the first Athenian citizen-based parliaments had assembled, giving birth to the notion of democratic decision-making and enshrining the right to freedom of speech as well as human equality. In the late 6th century BC, the Athenians managed to break the power of the aristocrats, and for the first time in history, the single citizen, regardless of status, could have a say in the running of the government. This was the birth of democracy. Demos meaning those of the land, and kratos meaning power. The assembly of the people was called the ecclesia, a word which specifically implies a gathering drawn together from many different places. Jesus used it in reference to his little group of followers, and the English derivative ecclesiastical is still used in reference to matters concerning the church. A key element of democracy was freedom of speech, and when your turn came in the ecclesia, you stood on a simple block of stone called a bema, and Paul would have stood on one as he addressed the Areopagitic Council. Paul believed in destiny, and as he stood before this group of statesmen, he must have been even more convinced that he was in the right place at the right time. It was summer, so the sun would have been baking this rough outcrop of limestone rock, but Paul seized his opportunity, and here is what he told them. Now, what you worship as something unknown, I'm going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by hands. And he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. He then told them, for he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead. Now, that last bit really set the cat among the pigeons. The book of Acts tells us that some sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." Much more positively, though, we're told, a few men became followers of Paul and believed. One of these was even a member of the Areopagus. Paul must have felt he'd made some headway. As he left the council meeting and headed home, Paul would have undoubtedly have been very aware of this building, particularly its pagan associations. Today, it's one of the most recognizable man-made structures in the world. The Parthenon is the crowning glory of Athens' famous Acropolis, which is also called the Sacred Rock. Acropolis literally means high city, and there have been monuments on this flat-topped outcrop since the Neolithic era. But most of what is seen today dates from the 5th century BC.
If the Agora was the beating heart of Athens, then the Acropolis was its head. This was the place where the Athenians from the earliest days built their palaces, and then in the classical era, their temples to the city's patron deity, Athena. Tyrants built them, democrats built them, and over the years it became not just the religious head of the city, but its flagship. The Parthenon, the temple that sits on the Acropolis today, is still the most famous monument of Greece. It says Greece to the rest of the world. My favorite fact about it is this, that there's not a single straight line in the Parthenon. Because 2,500 years ago, the engineers and architects who constructed it understood that if they did build it with exactly straight lines, it would actually look to us wonky. 2,500 years ago, they were able to understand that and correct for the optical illusion just enough, with every line just slightly curved, so that it looks to us straight. This was the extraordinary nature of this extraordinary building, sitting on top of this incredible pinnacle at the heart of this most fantastic city.
Athens offers a rich palette of food, entertainment, culture, and art. There's just so much here. One visit is never going to be enough. Paul had mixed success in Athens, but importantly, his message had been heard, and there'd been some positive responses. He had done as much as he could for the moment, so it was time to move on. Paul may have left Athens a little frustrated at his lack of headway, but in reality he'd done important groundwork, and over the next 3 or 4 centuries, Christianity took hold in Greece very rapidly, leading to the great era of Greek Byzantium. Paul's arrival in Macedonia, a few months before he fled to Athens, represented the start of something truly momentous: the arrival of the Christian message on European soil. Paul went to Macedonia in the middle of AD 50, landing at the far eastern port of Kavala. Back then, it was called Neapolis, and Paul arrived here after sailing across the Aegean from Troas, in what is now modern Turkey. The journey took about 2 days, and Paul was acting on a vision in which he had seen a Macedonian man begging him for help. Paul believed this was God instructing him to head west across the Aegean Sea to preach the gospel.
Macedon, in the wilds of northern Greece, a place always thought of by the southern Greeks, the Athenians, as barbarous, as uncivilized. And yet it had huge amounts of latent power. It was rich in resources, in timber, in minerals. But it was politically fragmented for much of its history. That was until the 4th century BC, when Philip II of Macedon and his son, who would become Alexander the Great, came to power. Under Philip, Macedon became an absolutely dominating fighting force, and under Alexander, it became the capital of an empire that stretched all the way to the shores of the river Indus in India. And it was Macedon that the Romans, when they began to conquer the Mediterranean, first came into contact, both in diplomatic terms and in military terms. And in 146 BC, as a result, Macedon became the first Roman province in Greece.
Paul might have been convinced about what he had to do, but it was still very much a journey into the unknown. At that time, Macedonia was a Roman province. It continued to be disputed territory for centuries and only became part of Greece in 1913, after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkan Wars. Today, it's the largest region of Greece and the second most populous, thanks to the port cities of Thessaloniki and Kavala. Kavala, where Paul first landed, is now a city with a population of over 70,000 people. It was founded at the end of the 7th century BC, and since then, it's been through the wars, quite literally. Not surprisingly then, fortresses, castles, and arsenals are key features of this now peaceful city, which is now the principal seaport of eastern Macedonia. Particularly notable is the Kamares, an imposing double-arch viaduct built in the Roman-Byzantine period and stretching 6 kilometers.
The Romans, as we all know, were great road builders, and the Via Egnatia was one of their finest creations. It stretched from the West Adriatic coast of Greece, went across northern Greece, across the top of the Aegean Sea, all the way to Byzantium, Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, in total about 1,120 kilometers long. And where it came to the Adriatic coast, on exactly the other side of the Adriatic Sea, that was where another very famous Roman road ended, the Via Appia, which started in the very heart of Rome itself. As a result, the Via Egnatia was part of a massive link that connected Rome and Constantinople.
Being a main road, parts of the Via Egnatia were around 6 meters in width with large stone slabs. It was built to last, and last it did, with parts of the original surviving to this day, including some of the sections on which Paul would have walked as he set out from Kavala on his way to Philippi. Philippi is only 14 kilometers northwest of Kavala, so it's likely Paul completed the trip in a day. The city is described in the Book of Acts as a Roman colony, and it was also known as Little Rome, such were its close imperial links. It would have been quite an alien place culturally for these traveling Jews, although Paul was actually a Roman citizen by birth.
The city of Philippi was founded by Philip II of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great. And in 42 BC, it played host to one of the defining battles in Roman history: Mark Antony and Octavius versus Brutus and Cassius, the murderers of Caesar. Brutus and Cassius had taken over the eastern part of the Roman Empire. And Mark Antony and Octavius came with their legions from Rome to challenge Brutus and Cassius for supremacy. They met at Philippi, and there were 2 key battles. The first in early October was where Mark Antony tried to surprise Cassius by crossing marshy land and making an unprovoked attack on his camp. That was a success, and Cassius actually committed suicide when he accepted defeat. But Brutus, on the other hand, had been successful against Octavius. And so in late October, a second battle took place: Mark Antony and Octavius versus Brutus and the remaining forces. And in that conflict, Brutus was defeated and 2 committed suicide. Mark Antony and Octavius were now masters of the Roman world. It was an epoch-making moment in Roman history, but it was also an incredibly important moment for the town of Philippi. After the battle, it was turned into a Roman military veteran colony, and so by the 1st century AD, as a result, Philippi was, to all intents and purposes, a Roman town.
The remains of the Roman city are truly remarkable, providing a first-hand experience of what life would have been like here. Although many of these remains are of buildings from the 2nd century AD, so the layout wouldn't have been quite the same as when Paul visited. But he certainly would have walked along this section of the Via Egnatia as it passes through the city. Perhaps what's most interesting about the remains of ancient Philippi, though, is the ruins of a number of large Christian churches, rather unromantically known today as Basilica A, Basilica B, and Basilica C. These date from the 5th century AD and are an indication of just how quickly and solidly Christianity became established here. And there's more. Near the Forum are the remains of the octagonal church, built around AD 400 on the site of an earlier, very small chapel, which was most likely the first church in the city and was dedicated to St. Paul. Yet Paul didn't have a particularly happy time in Philippi, and neither did many of the early Christians who are known to have suffered horrific persecution, possibly including being thrown to hungry lions, which was a popular Roman method of executing criminals and dissenters during the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The Hellenistic theatre, which dates back to the time of Philip II, was renovated by the Romans in the 2nd century AD for exactly these activities. It could hold over 25,000 people, and it's hard to imagine just how terrifying it would have been to face a gory death in this arena. This part of the Forum at Philippi is where the important administrative buildings once stood. And it's here that Paul was brought before the ruling generals to explain his recent activities. He hadn't been in Philippi very long, but already he was making waves. It started just a few days earlier with the conversion of Lydia, who appears to have been a wealthy businesswoman of some standing. Paul encountered her and some friends here, just off the Via Egnatia, on the banks of the Crenidus stream, where they were praying. The Book of Acts tells us that she dealt in purple cloth, which was a high-status material, and we also know she was Jewish, or, as the New Testament puts it, a worshipper of God. Paul seized the opportunity to relay the gospel story. Lydia was converted and baptized on the spot, making her the first European Christian. Today, this place is known simply as Lydia, and not far from the stream is the octagonal baptistry of St. Lydia, commemorating what was undoubtedly a momentous event in the history of Christianity. But it wasn't Lydia's conversion that got Paul into trouble. Later on, he met a slave girl who was a fortune teller, and she earned her masters a considerable amount of money from her predictions. After being converted and exorcised of the fortune-telling spirit, it was clear that this income was finished. So the owners wanted Paul punished. After appearing before the generals in the forum, Paul and his companion Silas were thrown into jail. Then something astonishing happened. During the night, there was an earthquake, which, it's recorded in Acts, shook the foundations of the prison, causing all the doors to fly open and everybody's chains to be loosened. The jailer, convinced all his charges had escaped, prepared to commit suicide, until Paul reassured him that nobody had run away. The jailer immediately requested that he and his whole family be baptized. The ruins of the jail in ancient Philippi have been identified, so we can place exactly where the events described in Acts chapter 16 actually happened. What an interesting little group of converts Paul made in Philippi. A businesswoman, a slave girl, and a jailer. Not only had the gospel crossed from Asia into Europe, it had also bridged the divisions of gender, race, and social distinction. So, despite a severe flogging and a night in prison, Paul was probably satisfied with the outcomes of his short stay at Philippi. He would be back, but ahead lay a much bigger challenge, the city of Thessaloniki. Thessaloniki was founded by King Cassander of Macedon in 315 BC, and even in Paul's time was a very important center of commerce and trade, partly thanks to its port and partly thanks to the Via Egnatia. Unlike the other ancient cities of Greece, this one wasn't named after a god, but after a person who was alive at the time of its founding. Thessaloniki was the half-sister of Alexander the Great and the wife of King Cassander. Down on the city's bustling waterfront, it's Alexander who is commemorated with a particularly majestic statue depicted sitting astride his famous horse, Bucephalus. The city walls have been rebuilt and reinforced many times, but some of the oldest gates remain, including this one on the Via Egnatia, and which consequently is most likely the one Paul passed through. It's called the Great Gate, not because it's particularly grand, but because of the association with the Apostle Paul. Rather more elaborate, though, is the Arch of Galerius, which also stands on the Via Egnatia. It commemorates the victory of the Emperor Galerius over the Persians, and the nearby rotunda was originally part of his mausoleum and is now the church of Agios Georgios. Being elevated, this area escaped a huge fire that destroyed many other parts of the city in August 1917, so the narrow paved streets, old squares and architectural styles of the Greek and Ottoman periods have been preserved. Also well preserved is the Byzantine period fortress called the Eptopyrion, obviously built here to make the most of a highly strategic position and subsequently extended by the Ottomans. As in Athens, the city's ancient agora subsequently became a Roman forum, and its remains are situated right in the heart of what's now modern Thessaloniki. Most of these ruins date from the time when the city served as the capital of the Roman province of Macedonia. This close proximity particularly emphasizes the contrast between the new and the old. It would be quite a privilege to look out over this site every day. These ruins include shops, civic buildings, and a circular bathhouse, but only a quarter of the original area has been excavated. The rest is still buried under the surrounding modern-era buildings. There's an underground museum on the site, accessed via the Cryptoporticus, a semi-subterranean corridor which was originally designed for the storage of perishables, as it allowed for the circulation of cooling air. Although under Roman control, ancient Thessaloniki was still run like a Greek city, with the three important components of a council, an assembly of the citizens, and a group of magistrates. As it happens, Paul managed to avoid prison in Thessaloniki, but he again raised the ire of the local authorities as his preaching started to get results. The book of Acts tells us that Paul went to the local synagogue on 3 Sabbaths, and that, I quote, "Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and not a few prominent women." Not a few, meaning many. As in Philippi, not all were happy with the progress Paul was making, and certainly not with his message about the new Messiah. So a lynch mob was rounded up to start a riot, presumably the pretext for giving him a severe beating. Paul and Silas kept out of sight, but Thessaloniki was no longer a safe place for him to be. So, under the cover of darkness, the pair left hurriedly, heading for Veria. At that time, Veria was an important staging post on the Via Egnatia. Immediately upon arriving in Veria, he made a beeline straight for the town synagogue and started preaching. If Veria wasn't on Paul's original itinerary, perhaps it should have been, because it was here that he experienced the most positive response of perhaps anywhere during his journeys in Greece. The book of Acts records that his message was received with great eagerness, and that many of the Jews believed, as did also a number of prominent Greek women, as well as many Greek men. Today, very little of ancient Veria remains, but parts of the old Via Egnatia are still intact, right in the middle of the modern town. And it's again quite moving to think that the Apostle Paul walked on these very stones. St. Paul's short stay here is commemorated by a large monument erected in 1961 and said to be on the site of the synagogue where he was so well received. Inevitably, news of Paul's activities in Veria soon got back to his pursuers in Thessaloniki, and he had to move on, this time on his own, although in the safe hands of sympathizers who escorted him to a sailing boat which would have taken them on to Athens. It would be 5 years before Paul returned to Macedonia, during which time the young churches at both Philippi and Thessaloniki struggled but survived. Paul continued to assist by remote control, writing a number of letters to them which contained advice and admonishments, and which are still used for guidance by today's Christian church. The seeds had been successfully sown. Such as here in a valley called Meteora in central Greece, where monasteries, some tiny, some larger, perch precariously atop pinnacles of sedimentary rock.
Meteora, perhaps most famous for being in the James Bond movie For Your Eyes Only. That's certainly the first place I ever saw it. But it is one of the most extraordinary natural phenomena, those rocky sandstone crags lifting up into the heavens. but also an extraordinary testament to human achievement. From the 9th century AD, religious hermits were getting away from it all, living in the fissures of the rock. And by the 11th or 12th century, there was a permanent monastic presence there. And then in the 14th century, you get the building of the first great monastery on top of the Meteora crags. And in the turbulent times of the 14th and 15th centuries, as Greece became part of the expanding Ottoman Empire, it's no surprise that 20 monasteries were built in the safety of the tops of Meteora, all of them only reachable by ropes and rope ladders and massive rope baskets to bring up goods and other necessities. It must have been quite a terrifying experience to get up there, because the ropes were only replaced when the Lord had broken them. Today there are only 6 monasteries and nunneries, in fact, left on Meteora, but they stand at the forefront of an incredible history.
Here, perhaps, is the most visually dramatic realization of what flowered out of the seeds sown by Paul as he journeyed across Macedonia centuries before. This cluster of monasteries is surely symbolic of Christianity's solid foundations in Greece. Had Paul made his journey to Athens overland, he may well have stopped at Delphi. Perhaps one of the most important archaeological sites in Greece, and certainly one of the most spectacular. Dating back to around 500 BC, Delphi occupies a series of terraces and slopes on the side of Mount Parnassos. So the views are panoramic across the Plistos Valley and round to the Gulf of Corinth. In Greek mythology, the location was selected by Zeus after he determined that this represented the absolute center of the earth. It subsequently came to be most associated with Apollo, the son of Zeus, and the god of light and the sun. The sanctuary of Apollo is a concentrated dose of ancient history, and packed into a quite small area is a temple, an open-air theatre, many treasuries resembling mini-temples, a Roman agora, a stoa, and numerous statues. All this can be navigated via the Sacred Way, which winds its way through the ruins. It's lined on either side with the treasuries which were paid for by various city-states, including Athens. In them was stored some of the loot from battles given as gifts to Apollo in thanks for the victories. The theatre dates from the 4th century BC and is located a little higher up the slope. So it provides a breathtaking view of the site and beyond. What was ever happening on this stage would have had to be very good to hold the audience's attention.
Delphi was, from the 8th century BC, an absolutely crucial sanctuary because it was home to an oracle of the god Apollo, the son of Zeus. And to this oracle, to find out indications of what might lie ahead in the future and what the gods had in store, kings, potentates, tyrants, and the everyday people of the ancient world came flocking. For 1,000 years, Delphi was the center of the world, the place to go to find out about what the future had in store. It was also a place of athletic and musical competitions on par with the Olympics. And over the centuries, it became a sanctuary full of gold, silver, ivory, bronze, a marvel to look at. And that sanctuary attracted Roman emperors, and indeed survived even into the Christian era, when those canny Delphians began to convert their pagan temples into Christian churches.
In the museum at Delphi is one of the best-known surviving statues from ancient Greece, the charioteer, also known as Iniokos. He's made from bronze, 1.8 meters tall, and commemorated the winning of a chariot race. Other fragments found with him indicate the whole work originally comprised the chariot, 4 horses, and 2 drivers, which would have looked very impressive indeed. The Temple of Apollo at Delphi was destroyed in AD 390 by the Christian Roman Emperor Theodosius I, primarily in order to silence the famous oracle of Delphi. The Delphi oracle was just one of many long-practiced pagan rituals and beliefs that came to an end as Christianity swept across Europe. And it had all started with one man. Paul experienced both highs and lows during his journeys through Greek Macedonia, and he was rarely in one place for very long, sowing the seeds of Christianity he fervently hoped would become established and flourish after he was gone. He was only in Athens for a short time too, before heading a little further west to the city of Corinth. Here, he ended up staying for 18 months, and even set up a business making tents. So, what was different about Corinth? We'll find out next. Let's take a quick look at our next episode and destinations. Undoubtedly, one of the most famous locations on the Peloponnese is here at ancient Olympia, the location of the original Olympic Games. These games were staged every 4 years, from 776 BC to AD 394. The idea being that all nations forgot their differences for a little while and came together in the spirit of sporting competition. What is particularly interesting about Olympia is that it was built specifically for the Games, and so there wasn't a resident population. But one exile, John, would have a significant influence on the island's future right up to today. Almost 1,000 years after John, a monk called Christodoulos came here in 1088 from the island of Kos, seeking solitude in the tranquility of Patmos. He wrote, "The loneliness of the island made me jump for joy." With the blessing of the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I, Christodoulos established a small monastery dedicated to the apostle, although he died before it could be completed. His followers finished the job, and this monastery was subsequently considered so sacred that it was even respected by the invading Ottomans and allowed to continue. Today, the fortress monastery dominates the skyline behind the narrow bay of Scala,